My dad, Earl Mitchell Hardenbrook, was born March 3rd, 1934, in the midst of the Depression years. His father died when my dad was only 2, so his mother earned the family's income working at Ralph's, and my dad was raised primarily by his grandmother, Mary Andrew Stone. Great-Grandma Mary died when I was still a baby, so I have no memory of her. But my dad frequently talked about her, about how warm, affectionate, generous, and kind she was. I think more than anyone else, she must have been the one who shaped the good man my dad grew up to be. My dad had an older brother, Donald, but he was brought up far away in a Masonic lodge, and so my dad saw little of him in his youth. In the absence of both father and brother, almost all the early influence on my dad was female. His grandmother, his favorite elementary school teacher, Miss Jackson, who introduced him to classical and folk music, and a sprightly young girl called Tony, who was his earliest playmate, and always concocted games in which she saved my dad from the fire-breathing dragon or other monster. All these women and girls left a very strong impression on my dad, and he was thus always respectful of women, valued their opinion, and always had a compassion and empathy for others, both human and canine. And he always saw nonviolent resolutions to any and all conflicts. Whenever I hear a politician pontificate about the threat of society becoming sissified if women have too much influence over men, I think of the females in my dad's life and think, well, if my dad is a test case for our sissified future, then I say, bring it on. He did, however, have a few close male friends. His closest was Bob Patrick, who happened to be a minor celebrity in Wizard of Oz fandom for his scholarly articles he wrote on, quote, the unexplored territory of Oz. My dad became friends with him one day when they were walking with a group of high school peers. Bob, who had a heart condition, was unable to keep up and soon fell behind. My dad was the only one who slowed his pace and dropped back so Bob wouldn't have to walk alone. That act of kindness and empathy was the start of a friendship that was very close and all too short. They had similar, gentle, kindly natures, and Bob introduced my dad to the Oz books, Sherlock Holmes, and other literary classics, which did much to solidify my dad's lifelong love of reading. He and Bob were very close friends until, due to his increasing health issues, Bob's untimely death in 1960 at the age of 33. My dad's other great passions were music and the theater. He told me once that he first fell in love with music listening to opera on the radio. He loved Gilbert and Sullivan, but his very favorite aria was I Dreamt I Dwelt in Marble Halls from Balfe's opera The Bohemian Girl. His love of acting started to express itself in his school years. His stage debut was in his elementary school's holiday pageant, in which he played the Mock Turtle from Alice in Wonderland. As he matured into a young man, he frequently appeared in community theater productions, where he shined in leading roles in such classic plays as The Corn is Green and The Hasty Heart. Besides the expressive emotions that was always in his acting, he amazed everyone with his powers of rapid memorization. In Hasty Heart, he had to replace the lead who had to drop out due to illness, and my dad successfully memorized all the lines in only 2 days. He also achieved rave reviews in the local papers for his role in the romantic comedy Dear Ruth as the geeky anti-hero who doesn't get the girl. But in real life, things were a bit of a different story, for my dad first met my mom in this production, and they took to each other immediately, as they shared a passion for both the theater and great music, my mom being, as she was, a good actress herself, as well as an accomplished pianist. Although my dad was so drawn to theatrics, he was also thinking about higher education, aiming possibly for a career in the legal profession. But his brother was already in college, and the family couldn't afford to send my dad at the same time. Meanwhile, my mother was suffering much stress and anguish from her dysfunctional family and was anxious to get away into the much more loving home my dad could offer. So my dad, selflessly giving up all thoughts of college, proposed to her, and they were married on October 20th, 1956. His dear friend Bob Patrick was his best man. Because my mom greatly admired the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, my dad ultimately became a structural designer, which at least then did not require a college degree. In the evenings, he and my mom continued to do plays for many years, sometimes in established plays and sometimes just for fun, improvisational fooling around. Although they waited longer than most married couples, after 12 years they celebrated the birth of their first and only child, who is this very familiar-looking person that I see in these photos. My dad taught me everything: how to dress, ride a bicycle, play baseball, fly a kite, amongst many other things. He was my confidant and comfort in my rough school years when I had few friends and was regularly bullied. But best of all, he read to me, not just when I was very little, but he read to me almost every single night from infancy until I started high school. I could not hope to guess exactly how many books he read to me, but you can see a fair sampling here. They run roughly chronologically from the upper left to the lower right, starting with things like Mother Goose and Dr. Seuss, and moving down through the Oz books, which Bob Patrick had taught him and now passed on to me, starting my lifelong affair with Oz. And finally, towards as I was approaching my teen years, science fiction stories, and finally ending with Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. But the books that he loved most of all are here in the center. The works of Lewis Carroll, especially Through the Looking Glass, Roger Kipling's Just So stories, and his very favorite of all, Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows. All those evenings of his reading to me greatly brightened and enriched my childhood, and made me, I think, a much more literate person than anything I got from school. He was the best father I could have wished for. I could always turn to him for compassion and guidance. And although after I was born he did less theater than he used to, he received much pleasure in public speaking and Toastmasters, where he frequently competed in both their humorous and serious speech contests, and won numerous trophies. Here is just one trophy that he won for his speech, Joey's Story. And I have to say, I have to admire his courage here, because in the so-called international speech contest that happens every year in Toastmasters, there's kind of an unwritten rule that it's supposed to be a very upbeat, feel-good kind of speech. But in Joey's speech, he gave a much more poignant message that I think proved his willingness to think outside the box and presents a really strong message from the heart. He also did many humorous speeches in Toastmasters, and he even created some humorous cartoons. Here's an example of just one of them, which I think we can all relate to, at least any of us who were ever faced with the prospect of having to speak in public for the first time. In 1993, my mom suffered a heart attack followed by quadruple bypass surgery. It led her to a deep depression from which she never recovered. For almost 10 years, my dad did all he could to take care of her, giving up all his other activities for her sake. And just as he had with me before, he read to her almost every night, Jane Austen being her particular favorite. But she was never able to break through the deep feelings of despair which prevented her from doing what she needed to do to recover her health. And after a long, slow decline, she passed away on Election Day, 2002. The passing of my mom led to many changes. My dad and I joined OCUUC in 2003, and finally reaching his long-delayed educational goals, my dad graduated from Coastline Community College in the spring of 2004 with a degree in paralegal studies. After graduation, my dad worked as a mediator at the Orange County Courthouse. He also worked on the sexual assault victims hotline, on which he consulted women who had been raped or otherwise assaulted or abused. I have always admired him for this, perhaps more than anything. His guidance gave many frightened women courage and hope for the future, and for many of them, the new idea that there were good, kind men in the world. In these years, he also shared his talents with the church, serving on the board of trustees and participating in many of the plays and readings and musical events. The one that I remember most vividly is shown here, where he's portraying Mark Twain in a monologue consisting of many of his quotes and speeches. And I also very vividly remember the time he read a visit from St. Nicholas to the children, and followed by an interview with St. Nick himself, played by Paul Gethard. In 2004, my dad had a short-lived neurological episode that at the time was diagnosed as a TIA, or mini-stroke. Usually these mini-strokes have no lasting effects, but in the years following, my dad suffered a loss of his peripheral vision and increased problems with his memory, and multiple bad falls. Eventually, a neurologist in 2013, a neurologist determined that this mini stroke had in fact been a full-fledged stroke that had resulted in normal pressure hydrocephalus, a rare condition in adults that causes an excess buildup of cerebral spinal fluid that puts pressure on brain cells and causes them to start dying off, which leads to the decline in mental functions that my dad was experiencing. Although a brilliant neurosurgeon had a shunt put in to help drain off the fluid, I fear the damage from the normal pressure hydrocephalus had already been done, and I'm afraid his decline continued. But at least he was able to enjoy one last hurrah in the theater. In 2014 and 2015, my dad and I took a theater class at Orange Coast College, where he was able to perform short monologues and scenes from his favorite plays. The teacher admired my dad and showed a compassionate tolerance for his limitations. At the beginning of 2016, my dad's deterioration began to accelerate, driven in part by recurring infections that his weakening immune system just could not shake. In April, he suddenly lost the ability to stand or walk, and he was sent to a nursing center where he spent the last few months of his life. My dad passed away quietly in his sleep on the evening of October 12th. A few days before that, as I sat at his bedside, I heard his voice for the last time. His eyes remained closed, and he didn't seem to know I was there, but he was quietly singing to himself. It gives me some solace to know that music, which had meant so much to him all his life, was what gave him strength and comfort as he departed his well-led life. My dad was more than a father. He was my best friend. At the darkest times in my life, when I felt alone or rejected, he was the one person who was always there to offer love and comfort and encouragement. His ability to communicate so well and eloquently inspired me to follow in his footsteps, and acting and public speaking are two of my biggest passions as well. But most importantly, he set for me a positive example of not conforming to society's narrow ideas of masculinity, and to lead a life of kindness, compassion, and open expressions of love.